want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon. My name is Fred Litwin.
Noted author Fred Litwin. And of course, Fred is also the author of I Was a Teenage JFK Conspiracy Freak, On the Trail of Delusion, and Oliver Stone's Film Flam, The Demagogue of Dealey Plaza.
Fred Litwin is here. He's a longtime author and certainly watcher of politics.
Joining us, Fred Litwin. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome to another edition of On the Trail of Delusion, your weekly podcast where I try to separate the wheat from the chaff and actually give you something substantial rather than the usual conspiracy nonsense you get all over YouTube. So today I'm very excited. I'm here with a very interesting JFK assassination researcher, Scott Maudsley, who I've been with in Dallas several times. He's one of my sort of JFK friends who we go on trips together, and Scott is a fellow Canadian. So welcome to On the Trail of Delusion.
Thank you so much for having me, Fred. Really great to be here.
So Scott, tell me, how did you get interested in the JFK assassination?
Well, I got interested when I was a young kid back in the early 90s when Oliver Stone's JFK came out and there was a big media hubbub. And I remember being in elementary school and one of the teachers talking about this movie, and it just kind of piqued my interest and got me interested. So I watched the movie, and of course, you know, it's a great work of the cinematic arts, and I got blown away by it, and I was captured by the story ever since.
And so what did you do? Did you turn to certain books, or what did you do after you became interested?
Well, I was very young at the time, so the first book I ever read about it was The Killing of a President by Robert Groden. And then, like 20 years later, I took my copy to Dallas so I could get Robert Groden to autograph it for me. That was a great moment in my life. But as you know, as I grew older, I read a lot more. I read Posner, I read Mark Lane. I've read a lot of stuff about the case.
So were you a believer in conspiracy at one point?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think most people who come to the story of the JFK assassination start off being a conspiracy theorist because that's the more, you know, popular explanation. It's the more entertaining explanation. And actually, I kind of became a lone nutter because trying to prove the conspiracy. I was like, okay, how can I make this work in real life? And I could just never make it work. And then one day I said to myself, wait a minute, why am I excluding the lone nut conclusion? And the second I stopped doing that, it all just kind of faded away and I was a lone nutter forever after.
Oh, well, good for you. I mean, it's you know, I felt when I sort of came to the light, it was sort of a feeling of relief, you know. It was like, oh, it all fits together and makes sense.
Yeah, I had a similar feeling when I saw the photo of the presidential limousine and you can see how the seats are like that. It just kind of clicked in my head. I was like, oh, okay, this makes sense now.
So you've done an amazing video that's on YouTube about Lee Harvey Oswald and his motivations. So let's talk about a bit about that. Tell us about Lee Harvey Oswald and why he might have killed the president.
Well, it's like his brother said, in order to understand the assassination, you have to understand his brother Lee. And his brother Lee is not an easy person to understand. Lee Harvey Oswald, he did not have a normal psyche. He was an archetypal, stereotypical personality. Recently, I listened to the audio version of a book called Inside the Criminal Mind by the authors Jacobson and Samenow. And these guys spent like their whole professional careers dealing with criminals. And they derived a lot of, I don't even know how to put it. They derived a lot of understanding as to the nature of the criminal personality. Samenow notes, he says, the terms that the psychiatric sciences use to refer to these people change as the years go by, but human nature does not. You can call them narcissists, psychopaths, sociopaths, antisocial personality types, oppositionally defiant personality types. It doesn't matter. It all kind of refers to the same thing. Inherently dislikable, disagreeable people who cannot properly function in society, can't maintain employment, can't maintain personal relationships or anything like that. And Lee Oswald and his mother were archetypal, stereotypical examples of that. I think that once you really get into the biography of Lee Harvey Oswald, examples are abundant. You can see it all throughout his life. He was an inherently discontented person. He couldn't find stability and purpose in his life, and he was a political militant.
Right. Okay. So what can you give us some examples of what happened in his early life that gives us, tells us a little bit about his personality or the fact he might have been sociopathic?
Well, he he was always violent. He was an inherently violent person, and examples of violence permeate his entire life. When he was young, he struck his mother a few times. He pulled a knife on his sister-in-law. He was chronically truant. He didn't want to go to school, and his mother pretty much enabled him throughout his entire life to behave however he wants to. A really good source in understanding Lee Harvey Oswald's psyche and motives is Oswald's Game by Jean Davison. She gets really in depth in examining his biography and pointing to the examples all throughout his life. But any time in his young life wherein he might have faced consequences and criticisms for things, his mother was there to shield him from that, to remove him from any kind of authority or responsibility that might have held him accountable. When he was young and in New York, we all know he had a psychiatric evaluation done. And that evaluation says that he has pattern personality disorder with schizoid features, right? Now, this is kind of like the terminology of the day, but we would recognize that today as like an inherently antisocial personality type.
Okay, so he was antisocial, and we could see that. But is that what made him into a killer? I mean, it's really he really, there was something
Well,
about him.
I mean, people like that are prone to violence. What really made him into a killer was opportunity. Lee Harvey Oswald did not find out that JFK was coming to town and was like, okay, how can I get into a tall building with my rifle to assassinate the president? He was already working in a tall building that overlooked the parade road. Like, I can't really stress this enough. Inside the Criminal Mind by Samenow really does a lot to demystify people like this and make them more understandable. Most crimes are crimes of opportunity. And that's why you have to be careful, because if you present yourself in a situation wherein a crime can occur, it will. If you make yourself into a victim, you will be victimized by these types of people. So it was mostly that he had the opportunity. He hit his mom because he had the opportunity to, because his mom was close to him. He pulled a knife on his sister-in-law because he was living with his sister-in-law. He got into fights in the Marine Corps because those were the people he was exposed to. He took a shot at Walker because Walker was easily accessible to him living in the same city. And eventually he killed Kennedy because Kennedy came driving by the building he was already working in. He killed Tippit because Tippit had the misfortune of encountering him. If Lee Harvey Oswald had walked through that intersection at 10th and Patton, 5-10 minutes later, like, Lee Harvey Oswald would not have gone out and said, okay, I'm going to kill a police officer. He just had the misfortune of interacting with a police officer and he killed him, because that's how people like that are. They will, if presented with the opportunity to commit a crime, they will. The author of Mrs. Paine's Garage and the Murder of John F. Kennedy, he was giving a talk at a Chapters bookstore like years ago. And he said, if it had been any other person in that parade, if it had been Richard Nixon or for some reason Nikita Khrushchev, Oswald would have shot him too, because the politics follow the psychology. It's about him having an aberrant psychology. It's not about his political beliefs or anything like that. That's just a veneer for what is fundamentally an antisocial personality type.
And he also he loved guns.
Yeah.
I mean, he really had a thing. I mean, what was that story about? I when he was 15, he really wanted to get that gun from the window. He wanted to break into the store and get a gun.
Yeah, the glass cutter and everything. And his buddy dissuaded him because he noticed the wire for the alarm system along the window. But I mean, again, it's a classic example of they went by the store, they saw the gun in the window, and they realized, hey, we have an opportunity to commit a crime here. If that store didn't have a gun in the window, Lee Harvey Oswald would not have said, hey, let's go break into some place to get a gun.
And so, okay, so and you know, I agree that Gene Davison's book Oswald's Game is tremendous. I mean,
It
that
is.
is a must-read book. I mean, I was blown away when I bought it. I had no expectations. I bought it secondhand because it's out of print, and I was just completely blown away by how good it was. She,
Yeah,
she,
me too.
she is just absolutely amazing. But also, let's go into a bit about Oswald's politics. What do you say to people, the conspiracy theorists who say that he was a right winger pretending to be a left winger?
Yeah, that's just totally contrary to his entire life. Like, as Davidson notes, the role of outsider is one that Lee Harvey Oswald openly sought and relished his entire life. As leftist youth, as Marxist Marine, as American defector in the Soviet Union, as Russian speaking returnee to the United States. Like, this guy's whole life, he was a leftist. I mean, if he was right wing pretending to be a left winger, then he did a very good job of that because he played that role literally his entire life.
Yeah, it was from when he was 15, when he was in the astronomy club and you know, was talking about communism. And you know, I think he was first radicalized by the Rosenbergs, I think in New York City when he was living there with his mother.
Yeah,
But I
as
mean, I find it astounding that Jim Garrison says, "Oh, you know, Oswald would have been happier reading Mein Kampf than Das Kapital."
well, I think it was in the PBS Frontline episode Oswald's Ghost where Norman Mailer comments on Lee Harvey Oswald and Hitler. It's that the example Oswald took from the story of Adolf Hitler is that a person can rise up through what Hitler called the triumph of the will, right? That a person could go from being totally destitute, like Hitler was, sleeping in flop houses and under a bridge, to being this demigod-like character simply through a triumph of the will. And I think that ideas like that probably encouraged Oswald to, go above and beyond. I mean, the guy did do some impressive stuff in his life. He went to the Far East. He went to the Soviet Union. He got the Soviets to let him stay there. He married a Russian woman. He learned to speak Russian. Like, these are not minor things. But he was not going to find meaning and purpose in that until society recognized him the way he thought he should be. And eventually, fate and circumstance created the opportunity for him to do that.
And he thought he was going to be great, right? He really thought he was going to be something really, really big.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm kind of loath to compare Oswald to Hitler because I think these guys are in two totally different
Of course.
categories.
No, no. I mean, I'm only raised that crazy quote from Garrison because he's so convinced that Oswald was posing as a left winger, which is, I think, absolutely crazy.
Well, Garrison was not like the most mentally sound person. I think what was really interesting about Garrison is long before he got into this JFK stuff, long before he was the district attorney for New Orleans, when he was in the military, he had two psychological evaluations done, and both of them were like, this guy's crazy. So, I mean, Garrison said all kinds of crazy stuff that should just be totally discounted. But on the note of Lee Harvey Oswald and Hitler, I think there are some comparisons that can be made in examining, because they were both like inherently antisocial personality types. They were both weirdos, right? You look at the example of Hitler's public persona versus who he actually was, right? The public persona was of this infallible, omnipotent demigod like figure who was always right, always certain, always knew what to do. But in the end, who was that guy in real life? He was this pouty little narcissist. He was a drug addict. And when things were not going his way, he would blame everybody else. You know, the military failed me, the people failed me. Lee Harvey Oswald kind of had similar traits. You look at the backyard photographs of him, that's his public persona, or at least how he wants his public persona to be, you know, all in black, guns, communist newspaper, the hunter of fascists. But who was he really in real life? He was a pouty little narcissist, just like Hitler. He couldn't hold down a job. He couldn't provide for his family. He couldn't do any of the regular normal stuff that a grown-up adult should be able to do. You know, it's not an apt comparison, but there are similarities.
And as well, and we haven't talked, but he also beat his wife.
Oh yeah, but I mean that's just in keeping with his character. He beat his wife, he beat his mom, he pulled a knife on his sister-in-law, he got into fights with people in the Marine Corps. Marina commented on that. She said, you know, some petty issue would send him spiraling into a rage, and it was just totally devoid of any kind of emotional or impulsive regulation. And again, you know, I keep coming back to Inside the Criminal Mind by Samenow. He comments on that. Antisocial personality types, they are so weak internally that they treat every minor petty issue like it's a hill to die on. They act like any small thing is a battle to be fought because they think as long as I'm winning these petty little battles, I'm being dominant over other people and I'm winning in life. So I mean, it's just more examples of his inherent antisocial personality type, his discontentness with life and the world.
Okay, and how did Cuba play into all this? I mean, he was disillusioned with Russia, with the Soviet Union, came back, but the shining apple in his life was Castro in Cuba.
Well, I think that was an idealized notion of his political views, you know? He went to the Soviet Union thinking it was going to be the work. You know, he went to the Marine Corps thinking the Marine Corps will roll out the red carpet and make me a general or something because I'm so awesome. Found out that wasn't the case, so he grew to hate the Marine Corps. And then he goes, okay, I'm going to go to the Soviet Union, the workers' paradise, and they're going to roll out the red carpet for me because I'm so awesome. But they didn't either. And eventually he came to hate the Soviet Union. Now his idealized focus is on Cuba. Oh, this is the real revolution, you know, real communism. And once I get there, I'm going to just find that happiness and contentment that I've been searching for. But if he had been able to get into Cuba, it would have played out the exact same way everything else in his life played out. Marina once said to him, you weren't happy in America, you weren't happy in Russia, maybe only on the moon would you be happy. If Lee Harvey Oswald could somehow get to the moon, he would not be happy there either. Because people of this ilk, they are pathologically unhappy. Because the things that would make you happy, the things that would actually give you meaning and purpose in life are internal. And he doesn't understand that. So he's looking for external sources of validation and legitimization that he will never find. The example of his behavior at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, it's a really good example of what we were just talking about, the pouty narcissist, right? He goes to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. He's got his dossier set up. He's got his CV. And he's like, yeah, I can be a provocateur. I can give political instruction, weapons instruction. I can give language instruction. I can do all these things. And the Cubans are like, okay, well, you know, we're not really interested, but thanks anyway. What happens? He has a complete meltdown and starts yelling and screaming and making a scene, much like Hitler in the bunker or how he acted in Russia. This is archetypal stereotypical behavior.
So he came back from Mexico City. He was clearly disappointed, horribly disappointed about what had happened, and that also must have changed his viewpoint of what was going on a bit as well. I mean, he wanted to go to Cuba. He wanted to send his wife and kids to Russia, back to Russia.
Yeah, and you know, to go back a little bit and talk about the Rosenbergs, Davison comments on that in her work, Oswald's Game. where Julius Rosenberg, his road to radicalization began in the exact same way Lee Harvey Oswald's road to radicalization began, by being handed a pamphlet on a street in New York City. I believe in the case of Julius Rosenberg, it was the case of Tom Mooney, a leftist labor leader, and in Lee Harvey Oswald's time, it was the case of the Rosenbergs. But the Rosenbergs, they were consumed by their ideology. They were consumed by this greater purpose that they serve, so much that they were willing to sacrifice everything for it, right? To martyr themselves to this cause. Their two children, I believe they had two young boys, were left orphans because their parents were executed, and the Rosenbergs themselves lost their very lives because of their activities. And I think that had a very strong imprint on a young Lee Harvey Oswald, the notion of being a martyr for a cause. So in his mind, that cause was communism, socialism. So everything else is secondary to that. You know, his wife, his kids, doesn't matter. They can go back to Russia. He's going to Cuba because he has a greater purpose to fulfill, you know?
And it's kind of interesting that, you know, he was radicalized by those pamphlets he got in New York City, and there he is handing out pamphlets in New Orleans.
Yeah, yeah, it's all very secular, you know? I don't think that Lee Harvey Oswald would never have been radicalized had he never been handed that pamphlet. I think that sooner or later something would have happened, because he was the type of person who is a good candidate for radicalization. But it's like, you know, the case of the Rosenbergs, even, like I remember this in my lifetime, that even in my lifetime, there were people still saying that, oh, the Rosenbergs were innocent and they were railroaded. And it's just like, no, they weren't. No, they weren't. Those people were spies.
Yeah.
They committed the crime of espionage. And actually, we believe that it was probably through the Rosenberg network that the Green Glass team in New Mexico passed atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, which allowed the Soviet Union to advance their atomic weapons program by like a decade, beginning the Cold War much sooner. What the Rosenbergs did made the world a much more dangerous place. And I don't think Lee Harvey Oswald had any understanding of that. That, like, dude, the Rosenbergs are not heroes. The Rosenbergs are villains, which is something else Samenow comments on in his study, that people of this type, they will be the victimizer, but they will always present themselves as the victim.
Hmm.
And they will also identify with other people who do similar things. So the more you look into it, the more you just see, like, you know, parallel after parallel after parallel.
By the way, one of my friends is Ron Radosh, who lives in New York. He lives in the DC area, but Ron wrote a really good book many years ago on what, you know, the Rosenbergs and the fact they were guilty.
Mm.
And he's been on a one man sort of effort to sort of counter the propaganda from the two sons, who are still to this day trying to convince people that they were innocent. You know,
Yeah.
which is really too bad. But and
Well,
Ron's
I mean, when it's your own
yeah,
parents, that's kind of understandable. But you know, I mean, we saw similar behavior from Oswald's daughter, right, back in the 1970s and 1980s. Even into the 90s, she was going on talk shows and TV shows, and she wasn't necessarily saying that her father was innocent, but she was kind of offering up this like tepid defense of, oh, you know, we don't know everything, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, it's understandable.
yeah, and I think Marina too. I think Marina, you know, initially really knew that her Oswald did it, but over the years, it's sort of more comforting, I guess, to sort of start to believe, well, maybe he was innocent. You know, and there's all these unanswered questions. Maybe I wasn't treated well, and you know, blah blah blah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you just got to look at her immediate reaction. She's in the house with Ruth Paine, and she hears President Kennedy's been shot. What does she do? She immediately goes to the garage to check to see if his rifle is still there. And she sees the blanket or the carpet wrapped up, and she thinks it's still there. And her first thought is, "Oh, thank God, it wasn't my psycho that did this." You know, the
Yeah.
fact that she immediately thought to do that is very telling, in my opinion. It shows that she was aware Lee is the kind of person who would do this.
Do you have any thoughts about some of the things that Oswald said or did after he was arrested?
Oh yeah, there's all kinds of stuff. Like when he was he violently assaulted a cop in the theater and then immediately turns to I am not resisting arrest, as if, punching a police officer in the face and pulling out a gun and trying to shoot him is not resisting. On the way downtown in the back of the police car, he's playing dumb. He's like, "Oh, what happened? Did a policeman get shot?" When he's being interviewed, he says, "Oh, the president got assassinated. It's no big deal. A couple days from now, there'll be another president." This kind of downplaying the harm that he has caused is, again, an archetypal feature of an antisocial personality type. These people will never take responsibility for themselves. They'll always blame somebody else. Samenow comments on it. He says, in the 50 years he spent examining criminals incarcerated, if there's ever actually been a violent criminal who regretted the harm he caused through his violence, Samenow never met that person. What he met over and over and over again are people who regretted being caught because it prevented them from doing what they wanted to do, or it made them look bad. It's like, oh, I got caught because I was stupid. I made this mistake or that mistake, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff that Oswald said after his arrest that kind of point to him having this archetypal stereotypical personality. My favorite one is twofold. It's during the press conference where he says, "I'm just a patsy. Did you shoot the president? No, they're taking me in because I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy." As if punching a cop in the face had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with him being arrested. Again, downplaying his own culpability, his own actions. But the other one I love is when a reporter asked him, "What happened to your eye?" He goes, "A policeman hit me." Yeah, it's like, well, did you hit him first? Did you pull out a gun and try to shoot him? Dude, if you hit me and pull out a gun and try to shoot me, I'm gonna hit you too. It's the victimizer presenting himself as the victim. And it's just like, it's the same thing with the Rosenbergs, saying, oh, they were railroaded or the government was out to get them. The government was not out to get them. They were not railroaded. They were guilty. Lee Harvey Oswald did not get arrested because he lived in the Soviet Union. The patrol officer arresting him has no idea who he is. But that's how these people think. They think like the world is out to get them or something. Lee Harvey Oswald's mother was like that too.
She was quite the mother, I'll tell you. I mean, boy, both of her sons really didn't like her. I mean, Robert and Lee didn't like her at all.
Whenever you encounter an antisocial personality type like this, it's tempting to lay the blame at the parents. Oh, the parents didn't socialize them properly, they didn't raise them properly. But invariably, you'll find an example of these people having siblings that are doing just fine and are not of this personality type. Like John Pick and Robert Oswald lived regular, normal lives. They did not become the kind of person that Lee and his mother were. I think that Lee, as a young kid, spending most of his time, spending more time with his mother than his brothers did, it really imprinted on him. He ended up being the most like his mother. And his mother, her sister, Lillian Murrick, commented that Marguerite was the kind of person who always had to be right about everything. Even when she was wrong, she had to be right about things. And if you had some kind of conflict with her, she would just instantly disappear out of your life until the time came where she needed something from you, which was usually money or a place to stay. And growing up that way, how do you think she would explain these things to a young Lee Harvey Oswald? She would explain it as, oh, the world is out to get us. Everything is so unfair. We have all these money problems. She would never take responsibility for herself. And her son grew up to be a similar type of character.
Yeah, Marguerite was always upset that Marina was getting more attention, and when Marina was getting money and all this other stuff, and she was always sort of upset.
Yeah, she calls a local Dallas radio station not a cab company, but a radio station, and says, yeah, my son is the accused assassin. I need a ride into town, because she knows she'll get a free ride. And while they're taking her into Dallas, she's in the back literally crying, saying, oh, everyone's going to care about Jackie and her kids. Everybody's going to care about Tippett and his wife and kids. And everybody will care about Marina and Lee's kids. But nobody's going to care about me. You know, that's just narcissism, straight up narcissism. Why should anybody care about you? You are not the victim here. But for people like that, they're always the victim in every situation. So it's like, I mean, every single person who ever met Marguerite Oswald in her life commented on what an inherently dislikable and disagreeable person she was. You know, that isn't other people's fault. If everybody you know does not like you, that's a problem with you. That's not a problem with everyone else.
Yeah, there's a story where Marguerite, they wanted her to put her on the Geraldo Rivera show, and she agreed to go on the show, and they show up at her house, and she said, oh, by the way, would you like to see my little shrine to Lee Harvey Oswald? And they say, yeah. She said, well, it's going to cost you an extra $500. And they,
Yeah.
so they paid it, and she has this little shrine, that she showed them.
It's like there's a scene in the movie Parkland where Robert is talking to his mother, and she says to him, I am the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald. I will never be a normal person ever again. I think that for people like her and Lee, that was like the worst fate ever, was to be a normal person. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
somebody once commented on Marguerite saying she thought the world should recognize her as being something special, but why? What exactly is it that makes you special that the world needs to recognize you for it? And it's just this inherently narcissistic and entitled attitude. I think that transferred to Lee a lot. Like, the world needed to recognize him. And if it wasn't for being the only Marine to ever defect to the Soviet Union, if it wasn't for being a leftist youth or a Marxist Marine or defecting to Cuba, he was going to find some way to force them to pay attention to him. When he returned from Russia to America, his brother met him at Love Field in Dallas, and he said to him, what, no reporters?
Yeah.
And Robert was like, well, I was able to keep it quiet. But later, Robert would comment that he could see he was disappointed that there were no reporters, because he had prepared comments, the questions he expected to be asked, the answers he would give, and the actual real truth of these things.
Right. Yeah.
But once he kills Kennedy and he's being shuffled from office to office in Dallas Police Headquarters, now he doesn't have to say what, no reporters. Now there are reporters from all over the world. Now the whole world wants to know, okay, what's this guy's politics? Why did he do this? What are his beliefs, his motives, et cetera, et cetera? And that makes him feel powerful. It makes him feel recognized. It makes him feel in control. He's having fun toying with the organs of the United States federal government, the Secret Service, the FBI, because in his mind, he has knowledge that now the whole world wants. So as long as he can keep them dancing for it, pulling the string, he can endlessly get that narcissistic fuel, that endless attention he needs, you know?
So why do you think he did not admit to killing Kennedy when he was in custody?
Because that's where his power comes from. His power now comes from withholding that information. As long as he can withhold the information that the whole world seeks, the attention will never stop. There'll always be people who want to understand him, want to talk to him, want to interview him, whether it's the FBI, the Secret Service, the Dallas Police, whoever, the media. That's what he craves most of all. And it's like, to admit why he did it is to willingly deprive himself of that power that he has sought his entire life, and he won't do that. He's getting what he wants. He wants attention, as antisocial criminals do, and now he's getting it. And because he's getting it, he's not going to openly say, okay, I did this and this is why, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think one other possible reason I think is that the killing at Tippit mucked things up. You can't go in front of the cameras and say, look, I struck a blow for the Cuban Revolution, or, I hate the United States, I struck a blow, but you killed a cop. A
Yeah.
working class person, you killed a cop. How does that help anything, And the other thing is, I also think that it's tough to admit any of that. Killing a cop, certainly while you're in police custody, is a dangerous thing to admit. Uh,
Yeah, definitely.
and so I think that, I don't know whether, if Ruby had not killed him, maybe there would have been a time later on where he might have admitted it. I don't know. But it was not the right time, I think, that weekend.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we'll never really know for sure.
Yep.
He might have. Like Samenow in his study interviewed lots of people. Like he makes reference to the DC snipers, John Muhammad and Lee Malvo. An interesting historical irony there. Another sniper named Lee.
Mm.
At trial, Lee Malvo was a young kid. He was a teenager. I think he was 17, 18 years old at the time of the DC sniper killings. And at trial, his defense tried to present him as, oh, he was a young, impressionable kid who was under the sway of an older, more embittered anti government man who was this father like character to him. And really, Lee Malvo was just an innocent kid who got wrapped up in some other guy's neuroses. That didn't work. Lee Malvo got a life sentence. But when Samenow interviewed him later on, Lee Malvo was not some innocent little kid who got swayed by an older man. Lee Malvo had a prolonged history of violence. And when Samenow was interviewing him in his prison cell, he said, I'm smart. I plan these things out. I didn't do this, just on a whim. We planned this. We made a car to use as a shooting blind. We did all this stuff. He was bragging to Samenow about what a great criminal he was. So, I mean, in the initial period after the shooting, Lee Oswald might have denied. But yeah, who knows? Maybe after he'd been sitting in a prison cell for a couple of years, he might have changed his tune just to make himself feel superior to others. Samenow also comments on the need antisocial personality types have to lie because through their lies, it makes them feel powerful because they know something you don't know. And when they lie to you and you believe their lies, it just feeds their power. It makes them feel more powerful, more in control. I've said this to people on the various JFK groups. Lee Harvey Oswald would have loved those people. He would have loved them because they feed his power, they feed his ego. He is subconsciously or maybe even consciously he would have thought, I'm above these people. I'm better than them. I'm smarter than them. They believe my lies because I'm smart and they're stupid. So I think all of those things explain why he never admitted to it. But I mean, he was only alive for like 48 hours. So, things might have been different had Jack Ruby not shot him.
Yeah, I'm struck by the fact that Sirhan Sirhan, lies continually about what he did, and you have all these people who are, I mean, if he was ever released on parole, they'd be having parties for him.
Oh, for sure.
I mean,
And I mean,
you'd have RFK Jr. holding a little party for Sirhan
the
Sirhan.
guy who killed his father, yeah, it's crazy. People are crazy, man. And the thing about Sirhan Sirhan and the assassination of Robert Kennedy is it's cut and dry. Like a bunch of people saw him shoot Robert Kennedy. The gun was taken literally out of his hand when he got dogpiled by a bunch of people in the kitchen. He never denied doing it. He was not killed by a Jack Ruby type character. He wanted to plead guilty. The judge wouldn't let him plead guilty. He went to trial, explained his motives, got sentenced, and has been alive ever since. He has never once denied killing Robert Kennedy. And still, there are people who insist he's innocent. And that just goes to show you, all the complaints about the evidence against Oswald, it doesn't matter. Even if the evidence was overwhelming, even if he had admitted it, even if he had gone to trial, there would still be people trying to defend him. Just like there's people trying to defend the Rosenbergs, Just like there's people trying to defend Sirhan Sirhan. There's no winning, you know?
Yeah, I mean, when it was even ridiculous when you had the family of Martin Luther King embracing James Earl Ray,
Yeah.
later in life. I mean, that was also pretty revolting.
Yeah, I would say so. Like honestly, I think you could probably power half of the United States with the energy generated by Robert Kennedy rolling over in his grave. You know, if I got killed like that and I looked down and my kids were defending the guy who killed me, I would be beside myself, you know? How
Yeah,
can you do something like that? Where is your loyalty, you know?
it
Well,
boggles the mind.
just to make another point to that, where is your loyalty? Your loyalty is to your ideology because you are ideologically possessed. Where was the Rosenbergs' loyalty? It was not to their country, it was not to their children, it wasn't even to their own lives, it was to this greater cause that they martyred themselves to. Where was Lee Harvey Oswald's loyalty? It was to this greater cause that he had attached himself to from the time he was a young kid. It wasn't to the lives of his children, the people he brought into this world. It wasn't to his wife. It was to some abstract notion. I don't know if you've ever seen the TV show on A&E. It's called The First 48,
No.
wherein a camera crew will embed itself with a homicide unit in a major American city, and they'll go from the time they get the first 911 call to the time they arrest and charge somebody with the murder, and they follow the case as it develops. And one of the detectives in one of the episodes said something very poignant that always resonated with me. He said, when it comes to murder, it's only ever about love or it's about money. That's it. That's the only reason why people kill each other for. It's either about love or it's about money. In the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, I think it was about love. It was about the love he had for himself and by extension, his ego and his ideology. And just like the Rosenbergs were ready to martyr themselves for their ideology, so too was he. So I think that moment where he's handcuffed, being led down through the police corridors in Dallas, given the raised fist salute, having microphones jammed in his face and reporters asking him questions, I think that was probably Lee Harvey Oswald at his happiest, ironically.
Yeah, and certainly there was nothing in his behavior that really suggested he was innocent that weekend.
No, no, not at all. Like in the Oliver Stone movie JFK, Kevin Costner as Jim Garrison, in the initial phases of the movie, he comments that he seems really cool for somebody under that kind of pressure. Yeah, that's because he's a sociopath, dude. A normal person would not respond but with that. Like when he was talking to his brother Robert, his brother was like, well, do you want me to get you a lawyer? And Lee was kind of like, oh, I guess maybe I'm trying to get a hold of John Abt. John Abt was a lawyer who made a name for himself defending communists, right? So
Yeah.
inherently, he wants a politically oriented lawyer for this politically oriented crime. But if that were me, I'd be like, yes, get me a lawyer. Get me like 10 lawyers. Get me all the lawyers you can get. I'd be freaking out. But he wasn't, because that's not how people like that function. He wasn't innocent. He knew he was caught, but he also knew he was on his way to what Davison called an infamous immortality, historical notoriety.
Yeah, and I think also he was incredibly cool when Baker had a gun at him on the second floor of the school book depository. I mean, I just think he was in that state where he just he wasn't reacting like normal people, like normal person.
Yeah. Yeah, because he's not a normal person. He's an inherently aberrant psychology. He's an antisocial criminal. And throughout his entire life, there were plenty of crimes that Lee Harvey Oswald committed. Eventually it escalated to murder. But I mean, that's also something you can look at from other criminals. Serial killers don't start off being serial killers. It progresses to that.
Right. Yeah, and certainly, he shot at Walker. I think that gave him a really good taste of, and he came so close. to getting Walker, and he got away with it. You know, he would have gotten away with it. I mean, that really must have fed into his psyche about it. This is something I could really do, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And it also shows that he was capable of that. He was capable of murder. And I mean, I don't believe that the politics of it had anything to do with it. Lee Harvey Oswald was just an antisocial sociopath. You know, it kind of makes sense, the politics in the case of the Walker shooting, because Walker is on the far right. He's like fascistic. So it makes sense that the leftist communist Lee Harvey Oswald, the hunter of fascists, would go after him. But it doesn't make sense for a leftist to go after a liberal democratic president who's friendly towards the Soviet Union like Jack Kennedy. It
Well,
just
I would tend to disagree with you on that. I do think that Oswald was he knew about and was pissed off about the administration's uh, harsh treatment of Cuba.
well, I mean,
And
I don't
I,
think the politics have nothing to do with it,
yeah,
but I mean, plenty of people had leftist politics and would not have done what Lee Harvey Oswald did. I think it's like Thomas Mallon said, the politics follow the psychology. Sorry, I didn't
yeah,
mean to interrupt
no,
you.
I agree with that. But I think that he was. I mean, Gene Davison's book really brings out that September 9th, '63 article in the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, where Castro gave a speech. It was reported in the New Orleans press, basically saying, if American leaders don't stop their terrorist tactics in Cuba, they're going to be next. And I think, and also with the communist newspapers he was getting, he knew that the Americans were doing some pretty nasty stuff in Cuba. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
there was a lot of anger in that man. He was pretty angry.
Yeah, but I mean that's the thing though. There was a lot of anger in him, and that is
Yep,
from where that's the genesis of his violence. But that anger was in him throughout his entire life.
that's true.
It,
Yeah.
it wasn't something that it's like he was a regular normal person and then he read about what the Americans were doing in Cuba, or he lived through the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and suddenly he's radicalized and is ready for militant political action. He was always that person. And had that not happened, it would have found another expression somewhere else, right? So
Okay, so
I
yeah,
don't disagree, but I think it's more about who Lee Harvey Oswald was as opposed to his political ideology.
yeah. So tell me, we've talked about Lee Harvey Oswald. I want to talk a bit about uh, conspiracy and the conspiracy world, and maybe your interactions with some of the conspiracy theorists, and or what are some of your thoughts on what you see on Facebook or whatever, just
That I mean, I myself became interested in the JFK assassination because of the prolific conspiracy theory culture that surrounds this event. I mean, you yourself described it as the mother of all conspiracy theories, right?
yeah,
So
it's
I mean,
no, I'm just saying it's the Rosetta Stone of conspiracy theories because you could use it for any political purpose you want. If you want to blame the CIA, if you hate Israel, if you hate whatever, you could use the JFK assassination.
yeah, definitely. It just neatly plugs into your larger worldview. And that's something that I've often encountered with interactions with conspiracy theorists on Facebook or YouTube or Reddit or anywhere else. These people come to the study of the JFK assassination already with a worldview, and they find a way to plug the JFK assassination into that worldview. So it is a very neat little thing that it can be used to justify any other kind of overriding ideology. But it's like in my experience, people tend to like narrow down their focus on one or two things, and that's like their wheelhouse, that is their expertise. They don't tend to look at it holistically and try to see everything. Like there's a reason why Bugliosi's book Reclaiming History, the first half of that book is a biography of Lee Harvey Oswald. Because if you really, it's like Robert Oswald said, if you really want to understand the assassination, you need to understand his brother Lee, and his brother Lee is not an easy person to understand.
Yeah, and just that segment of Bugliosi's book is terrific. I mean, it's a really good biography.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've read Oswald's Tale by Mailer. I've read Marina and Lee by McMillan. I mean, Marina and Lee is more the biography of Marina, but you do get a lot of biographical accounts of her relationship with Lee Harvey Oswald. But it's like the more you study Oswald the man, the more you come to understand, okay, this is why this happened. But conspiracy theorists, at least the ones I've interacted with, seem very loath to do that because that's not the conclusion they've already decided they're going to accept, right? So they're like, here's the conclusion we've already decided we're going to accept. Now, what evidence do we need to look at in order to arrive at our predetermined conclusion? They're not saying, okay, let's look at the evidence and see what conclusions that evidence can support. And honestly, I think the most effective lone nutters are the people who were once conspiracy theorists because they know the ins and outs of it in a way that people who were always conspiracy theorists never did.
Yeah, I mean, I was really struck when I debated Matt Crumpton last week
I
that
saw that.
that he doesn't really seem to have ever read anything but conspiracy books.
Hmm.
So he can repeat all the conspiracy factoids. Oswald was a poor shot, or didn't have no marksman ever did that feat, and without realizing, oh no, hold on, there's another side to all this, and
Yeah.
it,
Ruth Paine got Lee Harvey Oswald the job at the depository. That's the one I like the best. I mean, the guy is he's a lawyer. He's a defense attorney, right? And so he's programmed to come up with to sow doubt because that's all you have to do as a defense attorney. You don't have the burden of proof. So all you have to do, I mean, if you're a defense attorney, you don't have to explain what happened. You don't have to provide an alternative explanation. All you have to do is sow doubt on what the prosecution is trying to put forward. So that's what he's doing. You know, he talks a lot about all these coincidences that happen. Well, like in real life, coincidences happen, you know?
yeah, I mean, I'm also amazed at all a lot of conspiracy theorists play the legal game. Okay, in a courtroom, this piece of evidence would not be allowed, and this doesn't quite have the chain of custody that we really require in today's society, and so we could throw that out. And if you do all this stuff, then there's, some reasonable
Yeah.
doubt.
You can be Robert Kardashian and get OJ Simpson off, or you could be Casey Anthony's lawyer and get Casey Anthony off. Like a bit of a digression. I was reading something on the internet a while back, and the question was, what are the professions that the worst kinds of people gravitate towards? And the number one answer was lawyer. And they said that one of the things about lawyers is that arguing forcefully when you know you're on shaky ground is a really good trait to have if you're a defense attorney, but it also makes you for a bad person because good people don't argue forcefully when they know they're on shaky ground. They admit, hey, this is shaky, and they're honest about it.
Right.
But honest people tend to not make good lawyers, you know? People who want to argue, people who want to be right, people who can argue forcefully when they know that the facts are not really in support of what they're saying. Those people make the best attorneys and they are very successful. They make lots of money, but it doesn't really make for an intellectually honest person, you know?
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think if you really want to establish the truth of the JFK assassination, it's not a courtroom. We're not trying to determine guilt or innocence. We're trying to understand the assassination and everything that went along with that. And so I just get so frustrated with the legal stuff. And
Yeah.
it's
Well, also these people are kind of peering into a crystal ball and being like, "Oh, if there had been a trial, this would have happened, that would have happened." You don't know that. You don't know that at all. That's just speculation. And a lot of people don't understand. If you're on a jury, you can vote guilty or not guilty, but you cannot vote innocent.
yeah,
You know, you can vote not guilty whilst simultaneously believing that the defendant is in fact innocent. That's fine, but it's not required. You know, you can say, I honestly believe this guy's guilty, but the evidence isn't there, or the state did not make a compelling case against him. So even though I personally believe he is guilty, I'm going to vote not guilty. You know, it's like
yeah.
a court of law. I've had this discussion so many times with people on the internet. A court of law is not where we go to determine what is objectively true or not. A court of law is where we go to administer justice. And sometimes justice means letting a guilty person go free, because it's better for 100 guilty people to go free than for an innocent person to spend a day in jail. That's how our system is supposed to work, right?
Yeah.
It's like, look, I think O.J. Simpson is a murderer. I think that Casey Anthony killed her daughter. I understand that they were found not guilty, but that doesn't change what I believe. I think the evidence is there to support those conclusions.
Yeah, very true. So tell me, just as we sort of wrap up, what advice do you have for people who are getting into the JFK assassination?
I guess the primary piece of advice I would have is to not exclude the official explanation. That was the mistake I made a lifetime ago when I wore a younger man's clothes. It was because I had come to the study of the JFK assassination through Oliver Stone's JFK. I was, I guess you could say in some way I was propagandized or radicalized by that. So I was like, okay, there's absolutely no way that Lee Harvey Oswald did this. There's no way the official explanation is the correct one. So what is the correct explanation? And then I went searching for the alternative explanation, but I could never make it work. I could never make all the pieces fit together, I would say don't exclude the official explanation. The official explanation could be what actually happened. And all these years later, after a lifetime of study, I believe it is the correct explanation. But I spent so much time pushing that away in favor of what I expected the truth to be. If you honestly are a truth seeker, you must be prepared to accept that the truth, quote unquote, might not be what you want it to be. It might not be what you expect it to be,
Yeah, very true. I was, when I first got into this, I was kind of lucky because I was going to Concordia University, and we went to the library to look at their JFK books, and one of the books they had was American Grotesque by James Kirkwood. And so I took that out, and I knew nothing about Jim Garrison, but I read that book, and that was it was like a vaccine. It immunized me against Jim Garrison. Like I knew, okay, I can throw that out. That man is completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
And so I'm thankful that I read that book early on and never fell into the Garrison trap that so many people seem to fall into.
Yeah, Jim Garrison never looked as good as Kevin Costner made him appear in Oliver Stone's JFK. It's kind of like, Henry Hill never looked as good as Ray Liotta made him appear to be in Goodfellas, like they make these movies that are based on a true story, and these Hollywood actors, they make the people in the movie look way better than how they actually were in real life.
Yeah, that's really true. So, what books do you recommend people should read on the JFK assassination?
Well, I know this isn't probably going to be an unpopular answer, but I recommend you read all the Lone Nutter books. I think Reclaiming History is probably the most definitive and thorough account. It's highly detailed, comes with the CD of like thousands of pages of endnotes and footnotes. That's probably the most authoritative account. If you want something a bit more condensed, Case Closed is great. If you want to understand Lee Harvey Oswald's biography, Psychology and Motives, Oswald's Game by Gene Davison is highly recommended, as is Oswald's Tale by Norman Mailer. Marina and Lee by McMillan is an excellent account of Marina Oswald's biography and her relationship with Lee. It gives a very intimate view of, the private persona of who Lee Harvey Oswald was behind closed doors. But honestly, I think you should read everything and anything. I mean, whatever angle you want to come at this from, there are books and materials that will channel you into it.
And what's the name of that book about the criminal mind that you talked about?
Inside the Criminal Mind by Dr. Scranton Samenow. It's available on Audible if you have an Audible subscription. That's where I got it. It did a lot to really help me understand people like Lee Harvey Oswald and others of his ilk, but it also did a lot to help me understand some people I've known in my own life personally. Suddenly, a lot of this behavior makes a lot more sense having read that work.
Okay, well, that's a good one. I think I'll have to pick that one up because I haven't read it. So, yeah, thank you. Any last comments you want to make before we sign off?
Yeah, check out my YouTube channel, Scott's Thoughts on YouTube. I have a video that discusses Lee Harvey Oswald's Psychology and Motives. And yeah, I got a lot of JFK related material on there, discussions, so you and I doing stuff in Dallas, me and a buddy of ours, Fred James, watching Oliver Stone's JFK and commenting on it. If you're interested in the JFK assassination, I got a lot of stuff on my YouTube channel. Check it out. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe.
Okay, great. Well, that's fantastic. I have to say your video on Lee Harvey Oswald was just terrific. Really, really amazing
Awesome.
video. So
I
thank you very
appreciate
much.
that. Praise
So thanks,
from
Scott.
Caesar is praise indeed.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it was a great edition, a great interview, and we'll be back in a few weeks with another edition of On the Trail of Delusion.